Welcome to Founders Mindset. This podcast dives into the stories of visionary founders and the incredible people who power the startup ecosystem. Whether you are building your own venture or simply curious about the world of startups, you are in the right place. Today's episode, the conversation with Art, the co-founder, Crux Defense. We met at the Defense Hackathon in November. So we talked about the future of defense innovation. And also, please subscribe our channel and also give your like. Let's get started. 行きましょう! So Art, thank you so much for attending our podcast today. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing very well and very much enjoying this atmosphere that we're in.
Yeah, so we are here.
It's the Hornet. It's the Hornet. Is the aircraft carrier. Kind of famous because in the museum you will see is the lunar module from the splashdown. This is the ship that actually recovered the astronauts who went to the moon.
Moon?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. 1969. So a long time ago.
I see. Amazing. Kind of we are in the historical place.
Yeah, this is and that's why the ship still exists. It is a very historic place. Took part in a very historic event in not just U.S. history, but in the whole of the world's history.
Wow.
Right?
I'm so honored. Okay, so please imagine there are many audience. So, Art, could you please introduce yourself? What do you do in here, this hackathon?
Certainly. My name is Art Trevethan. I am a supporter of defense innovation, although I try not to use the word innovation because in my business, we support the transition of technologies out of the research area and into actual defense budgets. We do a lot of work with the Department of Defense in the U.S., as well as with companies who want to provide their services to the DoD in terms of finding out who the right people are and who has the budget to be able to interact with them. I'm here because I love the startup environment. It is filled with such energy and such bright young people who are bringing that energy and that ability to work 24 hours a day. A little bit older, can't quite pull it off anymore, but these are the brilliant minds of tomorrow, right? And I want to help them get through and get to the next phase so that, you know, one of the sayings that I use is it's great to do something nice for the military person once. But if they start to rely on it, you have to make money at it, and finding those ways to make money at it so that you can continue to do it over and over again as a repeatable process is exceptionally important. We have to be able to rely on our innovations to carry us forward, and we can't do that if the system is so hard to work in that nobody can pay their mortgage.
Totally. And then you mentioned DoD. This mean?
DoD refers to the Department of the Defense. It is the U.S. Department of Defense. It's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, and DIU. When you look from other countries, it might be called the MOD. MOD. You see that in Britain and others. And we do work with organizations who are looking to come into the U.S. market. So a company from Australia or New Zealand or the UK who wants to start bringing their products into the U.S. It is a slightly different structure as far as working with our Department of Defense than it might be for theirs. So we can act as an educational resource.
So let's talk about this defense hackathon. So your responsibility is judge.
Yes, judge and mentor.
Mentor.
Yeah, so I'm going around and having conversations with various startups, and many times, and I'm going to say kids because I'm a little bit of an older guy, but these younger people, they bring an energy, they bring a desire, but they may not have the experience. So the experience that myself and many of the other mentors and judges bring come from having worked in this field and we say, you might want to consider this or that to help them come to a more complete realization of what their idea is, or if somebody's already doing it. There was a company I talked to yesterday where it was like, look, don't focus so much on the UI, focus on the data feed, right? Because they already have UIs and they don't need another UI. Focus on the data feed that can be represented elsewhere. That's a little bit of internal knowledge that comes from years of experience that tells them a better direction to go.
I see. Thank you. So, Art, I really love your passion, like building your software and team, and also you are super like giver first person. That's why in this few hours, I saw you are talking with many folks, listening, and then giving suggestion, but super soft way. You don't push. It's amazing.
In every case, being the source of information, being the give first, is of incredible value, and it will return to you. Very often I look at myself and what I do as being a power connector, finding people who, have a conversation with one person, the next person you talk to, you're like, you two should really talk to each other. Let's start a little fire. Put them together and walk away, right? Because while I might have some things to add to the conversation, very often I don't. I just see a connection between them. So I want to put them together. If they start building a fire that ends up turning into something that helps our national security, national defense, or even just in building the next widget, that benefits me in the long run, right? And by being a giver first, it really sets up the opportunity that you have to influence the way things are going to move and to make sure that things continue to move in a positive path.
So, okay, next, let's deep dive into your company. So, company name
Certainly. The name of the company is Crux Defense.
Crux.
Yes, Crux, CRUX. And we can be found online at cruxdefense.com. We actually have two sides of our business. One side focuses on the DoD itself as far as providing assistive training sessions and exercises so that they can discover and build out additional methodologies and paths through their own complex system. On the other side, we will work with startups perhaps a little more advanced than what we see here, but startups to help them identify their funding path through the environment. We also will work with venture capitalists as far as helping them with their due diligence, even economic development, right? The federal government is a tremendous source of funds for cities, towns, and areas across the United States. And looking at your economic development environment, the reports that we provide can be very assistive in determining where you put your efforts towards in terms of bringing in companies, in terms of who are buyers and who are sellers to the federal government.
I see. Okay, so you mentioned you have two kind of big different
Yes.
What can I say, department or divisions. So I wonder, which did you start at first?
We started trying to help the DoD itself first. That was the first place we went, and found that the tools that we were creating to facilitate our work were tools that would be very beneficial to the rest of the marketplace. And quite frankly, anytime you're working with the government, you kind of want to have a backup. You want to have a secondary plan because the government can be fickle. It's just the nature of a political organization that you have to be prepared for longer time to bring your company up than it is in a B2B environment. So to that extent, we have both the B2G, business to government, and we have the B2B side, business to business side.
I see. Interesting. And then so your company, Crux
Defense.
Crux Defense. also has a software.
Oh, so we are building software that are our internal tools. Because they are financial tools that basically look at the government spend over the last 15 years, that look at the orders and the reasons for those, it's an analysis tool. So instead of providing our software to the general public, because quite frankly you have to understand it somewhat, we actually provide a report that we pull out of it that is bespoke to the company that our analysts have worked on to determine here are the best directions for you to go in terms of both strategically as well as the tactics as far as selling. Right? So that is very important. If you let people go in data, you can find yourself down a rabbit hole if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. Our analysts know how to use the tool and the information to better divine what your best paths are. And that takes some onboarding, it takes getting to know the company, but that allows us the insights to be able to provide companies with their best path forward.
I see, amazing. So, Art, this internal product,
Yes.
When did you finish to build, or still you guys are building?
So we're always building. Okay, there are facilitators that come along the path that we're always going to build in, but our first release of the product, which of course was, very mechanical Turk. It gets better and better as we go on.
Like a Kaizen.
Yes.
I love it.
Absolutely. You always start out with mechanical Turk because you can't define all the things you're going to run into. And it's gotten more and more automated along the way. We're never going to remove the human effort because this is the best computer you'll ever run into. But we first brought it to market in March of 23. We've been on the market a little bit more than a year. We've been very successful with it. It provides something that is definitively of value to companies who are trying to do business with the DoD, as well as we've grown our business on the DoD side. Most governments around the world are on UIs that were designed in the 60s and 70s, right? And that comes down to budgetarily. Does it work? Yes. Does it turn out correct information? Most often, yes. Are you using the latest and greatest technology? Well, it works, so we haven't spent any more of our budget on it, right? So even though it works, UI and UX is very important as the next generation of workers come up. There are very few, or were very few, government systems that will work on a cell phone. And very often you're not allowed to use that because you're in restrictive environments where the cell phone doesn't work. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. You need to continue doing the work. The government exists to serve the people. Am I serving the people best by making the user experience better or by making their experience better? And so if my people are trained to use the older interface but can relay the information, it would be nice for us to have that UX work done. However, it's a lower priority than actually servicing and being responsive to the taxpayer, which is why many systems in the government, honestly, your cell phone has more compute power than what we use to send a man to the moon. Right? Technology has leapfrogged. The government is not a software development shop and therefore tends to run a little behind, but builds inefficiencies elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Art. Okay, next question. Let's dive into your history. So is this your first company as a founder?
No, it is not. My first company as a founder was as a child on a small plot, growing vegetables and going up and down the street selling them to my neighbors. I was bit by the entrepreneurial bug very early on. I have worked in insurtech, fintech, medtech, a whole variety of different places. I've started 5 companies. Yes, and always a learning experience, not always a rousing success. but that's how you learn. And this one, this is Defense Tech, which is the kind of the pinnacle as far as I'm concerned, because in defense, you actually cover all of those other things. Defense is a society to and of itself, and that society has everything that you see in society generally. You have medical, you have insurances, you have law enforcement, you have all of the things that you see anywhere else exist on a base, exist in the culture of the DoD or of the armed forces, and that is important to recognize. And so it's a very variable field that actually allows you to dive into a whole lot of problems. So as I stated in some of my previous startups, we were providing product and services to the federal government at different levels. I had the opportunity, and while I was doing that, I thought, oh, the government's really hard to work with. And you have this naivete that the DoD or the federal government is just a bad customer. They make you go through other work. But then when I went in and I worked for the U.S. Army as a civilian, I started to develop kind of the same feelings towards the entrepreneurial efforts where it's like they're making it difficult to work with them because the government has a different language, a different way of doing business. And what it comes down to is actually a clash of languages and personalities, a clash of cultures. They need each other because the government has tremendous funds and capability to advance technology. The startups and the even mid-tier or other companies have the ability to provide those technologies. And when they try to come together, there are some clashes, right? And there are cultural clashes. So as a part of my company, in the education that we provide, not only through the financial, but through the support of it, we try and inform each side of that equation as to, hey, you might want to talk about it this way. It's what makes sense to them. And understand the culture of the person on the other side of the table. And that makes the transition much more ready.
I see. So you found the pain point first,
Yes,
and then came up this idea, and then made your company. It's amazing.
Yes, and,
Yeah.
and you asked the question of, why do a startup again? I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. I really enjoy building. I really enjoy that effort. So although I've done it before, I will probably do it again, right? This is where I draw my joy, and I tell people that my job is my hobby, right? So I enjoy doing this. It's part of what brings joy to my life, and it brings meaning and purpose.
I see. So do you have your co-founders?
Yes, I do have co-founders. I have two partners who are in Texas. I also live in Texas, and my co-founders come from. One of them has a background in special operations. Another of them has been doing SBIR, STTR work for a number of years, and it was everybody contributed a part to this, right? Whether it be reputational, experience, or otherwise, so that we could all come together and contribute our part to what makes this special and what addresses the need that the marketplace is asking for.
So so you met two other co-founders,
Yes.
and then did you guys join any accelerator at the time?
No, we've not joined an accelerator, and quite frankly, we are bootstrapping this company. Like I said, we've been successful in bringing in enough to keep going and starting to build upon that. But we are in the startup journey as much as anybody else is. We have a specialty and a niche where we fit, and we're not going to do everything for everyone, right? If one of these companies that's four guys who just got together to solve a problem, they're not even ready to use our tools yet. So I'll tell them that, hey, let's talk when you've reached a certain level. I would say the same thing about us. We are at a a little bit more advanced level of maturity in that we've built our products, we've taken them to market, we've been able to successfully deliver them to clients, both on the military side as well as in the commercial market. That doesn't mean we're done growing. That doesn't mean that we have completely solved for X, but we've got enough of X solved that we are delivering value, and that value is recognized.
So your business is kind of matching to defense company and government, and also your personality just connector. So this connector personality is nature or nurture?
Oh, wow. A little bit of both. I grew up in a household that was very service oriented. My mother was a nurse. I was heavily involved in Boy Scouts as a child. I'm an Eagle Scout. Continued to do that throughout my life and even assist with it now. I've been a Scoutmaster. Yes, Scoutmaster. I was district leadership for our local scouting organizations. I participate in localized charity organizations. I play Santa Claus. And I always want to bring joy to the children. I want to bring advancement to the people, and I want to help people out. And I think that it is some nature, some nurture. I think it is of my nature, and I think that nature was supported from an early age.
I see. Okay, thank you. Last question.
Sure.
Art. So tell us about your next milestone in the next 1 year for your private and for your career.
So I think my next milestone for the next year is it's a couple of things. Number one, continue to grow the business to ensure that it's self-sufficient going forward. Number two would be to identify and find 5 to 6 companies to act as an advisor for on an ongoing basis that I feel are world-changing technologies. And number 3, to increase the amount that I give to charity over the course of the next year, so that we can continue to build out from, the social side, more and more Thanksgivings and good tidings for the people in the community.
How about your private?
I came out here, I'm in San Francisco on this amazing ship, historical environment. I live in Texas, and I was asked to do it. I'm like, yes, I'll jump on an airplane and I'll come out. It's important to support the community. That, yes, that's my private community, but yes, that's also the entrepreneurial community. It is the defense community. It is the communities that make us, number one, feel safe where we are. Number 2, protect our way of living. And number 3, just allow us to do good in the world, because it will come back to us.
Thank you so much for being here. It's amazing wisdom. I believe our conversation will help many people's future and career. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Art today. 1. Bringing startups and defense innovation. Art emphasized the importance of helping startups navigate the complex defense industry with a focus on translating innovative technologies into sustainable and impactful solutions. His company, Crux Defense, plays a key role in connecting entrepreneurs with the Department of Defense, DoD, fostering meaningful partnership and making defense innovation accessible. In particular, the Defense Hackathon stands out as a pivotal event where solutions are devised to addressing pressing global needs, such as supporting the US DoD and Ukraine's defense effort, while fostering a robust defense startup ecosystem. 2. The power of mentorship and giving first. Central to art philosophy is to be a power connector, identifying synergy between people and ideas and facilitating collaboration. His participants in events like Defense Hackathon because he likes to interact with builders, offer guidance, and connect potential matches to the right people when he finds them. His give-first approach fosters innovation and creates a ripple effect, positive impact, benefiting both the defense sectors and the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem. Art believes that in the long run, by giving selflessly to others, you will receive help and support when you need it most. Like happy return, right? In Japanese, we said, 情けは人のためならずかな? 3. Natural giver. Art's passion for helping others stems from his upbringing. His mother, a nurse, and his experience as an Eagle Scout, a deep sense of service and community. He's continued to embody this spirit, actively mentoring, advising startups, and supporting various communities. His innate desire to help others fuels his dedication to building not only companies but also connections and ecosystems that thrive on collaboration and mutual support. Okay? Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope our conversation will help your career and future. And if you like this episode, please subscribe our podcast and give your like. OK, じゃあね、バイバイ。またね。